Thank you, everybody, for coming. This is a wonderful occasion. We are welcoming some wonderful speakers and also Péter Forgács, who is the artist in residence at the YIVO Institute, whose installation, Letters to Afar, is now at the Museum of the City of New York, and I urge all of you to go and visit it. You will see something you have never seen before. Unless you were in Poland and you happened to see it about a year ago. It is a work of astonishing beauty, of a kind of unique and extraordinarily haunting and nuanced artistry that has freighted inside of it a deep historical experience that I think all of us, whether we are Jewish or not Jewish, can and in some way must learn to appreciate. And this extraordinary work, Letters to Afar, will help us do that. I won't say more, but I do urge you all to see it. It will be at the Museum of the City of New York until March 22nd, 2015, so you have some time, however ambivalent you may be, either about museums, Polish Jewish history, or films. I want to mention that the Klezmatics wrote original music for this work, and Péter worked with the Klezmatics on that score. It's remarkable, the musical, I wouldn't say accompaniment, it's not accompaniment, it's musical interpretation of the images that you will be seeing. And while I'm talking about Letters to Afar, I want to thank the Museum of the City of New York, who is YIVO's partner in this exhibition, Susan Henshaw-Jones, who is the director of the Museum of the City of New York, and Fran Rosenfeld, who is public relations curator, for working with us on tonight's program. Tonight's program, Can We Tell the Past, Creating History, is a complicated title because we know that whether we can tell it or not, we endlessly talk about it. And as far as creating history is concerned, we really can't prevent ourselves from doing so, no matter what we do. So there are a variety of conundrums built into this evening's discussion, which I'm sure we will hear more about. I also wish to thank the New York Council for the Humanities for providing funding for tonight's program. I want to say that I just got back from Poland, Warsaw, where many of you undoubtedly have learned of the opening of the new museum there, which has changed its name from the Warsaw Museum of the History of Polish Jews to Poland. So you may start seeing it turn up as that. It's an extraordinary edifice of remarkable beauty. The architectural design is extraordinary. The exhibits are informative, and the whole thing represents, as the director of the Adam Mickiewicz Institute said to me, he said he thinks that it represents, that it will change the ethical landscape of Poland. That's a big statement. But that's what he said, precisely because it represents for the first time a real initiative on the part of the government, working with the Jewish world, working with the Polish world, historians, to try to create a symbol of, or a place where this history can be seen and appreciated and studied and transmitted in whatever little tiny sound bites they're doing it in the various exhibitions, to children and to a new generation of Poles and Jews. So again, I would urge you all, regardless of your feelings, and I know that feelings run very high in relation to Poland and Jewish history, if you have the ability to do so, I urge you to go and see this museum in Warsaw. I want to mention that there will be a post-show discussion this evening in the Great Hall right outside, in which whatever issues get raised in the discussion, you will have a chance to follow up with the panelists to continue. And so we're hoping, in any case, that you will wish to take part in this, and we're hoping that it'll be lively and enjoyable for everybody. Two more things. There is a survey, which I think you all received, yes, in the program, and please fill it out and place it on the table outside the door. And the last thing is, please become a member of YIVO. It's very simple. You just fill out something out there. We need your support. Without it, we can't have programs like these and many others. It's very important to us. If you're interested in this world of East European Jewry, interested in helping to support our research and helping to support our ability to continue to preserve the documentation of this world, to undertake new programs and new exhibitions such as Letters to Afar, please become part of this community by supporting us. And now it's my pleasure to invite all the panelists to come up on the stage and get the program underway. Thank you very much.
I don't need it. Well, welcome. My name is Amelia Glaser, and I want to thank, it's really an honor to be able to moderate this panel. I want to thank Jonathan Brent and Helena Ginzy and the YIVO Institute for putting together this, what promises to be a wonderful conversation, and for posing the following question to us. How do we enter the past? Which, of course, in turn poses many other questions, like, is the past a foreign country, as the novelist L.P. Hartley has written? If so, we should be able to visit. We should be able to learn its language, to conduct interviews. Well, institutions like YIVO might be seen as vehicles to this place. They offer researchers access to a collective history of East European Jewry, sometimes to personal family history. But even with these resources, aspects of history, like our own memories, continue to remain hermetically sealed. The Russian poet Osip Mandelstam wrote in 1930 of his native St. Petersburg, which had by then transformed into Leningrad. Petersburg, I still have addresses where I can look up the voices of the dead. Well, Mandelstam, whose poetry resists the idea of linear progress, whether Hegelian or Darwinian, preferred that the present should rub up against the past. He had this sort of symphonic understanding of time, where his family's Shtetl, his beloved classical Greece, and Pushkin conversed with one another. Well, Mandelstam's vision of history arrived in large part via the French philosopher Henri Bergson, who in his Introduction to Metaphysics imagined time as a single thread. Each end was wound around a kind of spool, and as we go through our lives, the spool of our past gets a little bit larger, and the spool of our future gets a little bit smaller. We can't go back, and no two moments can ever be identical, but the past, which has been wound around other moments of the past, becomes cumulatively larger, and each moment informs one another. It becomes richer. Certain experiences almost seem to touch one another, although, of course, they don't. So how do we make sense of this growing cumulative spool of our experiences? Undoubtedly, the way that thinkers conceive of the past changes with disciplinary differences. A theologian or an evolutionary biologist would have their own answers to these questions. For the purposes of tonight, we have invited 2 historians and 2 artists to take part on this panel. And each of them, from their own perspective of the humanities, is going to say something about their own approach to history and to the conversation that will remain open-ended. Professor Stephen Zipperstein, who is the Daniel E. Koshland Professor of Jewish Culture at Stanford University, is the author and editor of 8 books on Russian and Jewish cultural history, and these include his now classic study of Jewish Odessa, historical biographies of Ahad Ha'am and Isaac Rosenfeld, and he's currently at work on a large cultural history of Russian Jewry at the turn of the 20th century. Marci Shore, a professor of intellectual history at Yale University, is the author of Caviar and Ashes, a Warsaw Generation's Life and Death in Marxism. She's also written a very personal book about her immersion in the East European past and present at the time of the Velvet Revolution and the collapse of the Soviet Union. Well, does fictionalizing history give us access to emotional truths about the past and about the present, which we don't have access to through fact alone? Boris Fishman's novel, A Replacement Life, follows a young Russian-born American as he comes to terms with his lack of knowledge about his own family's experience of the past, and in this case, namely of the Holocaust and World War II, seen from different perspectives. Historical images, photographic or filmic, have the power to make us feel closer to their time and place, but they also can frustrate us with our lack of access to the whole picture. As the film scholar Aaron Kerner has written of Péter Forgács, treating home movies as excavation sites, Forgács reassembles past lives, what otherwise might have been lost to oblivion. Well, I think this comes through especially clearly in the installation letters to Afar, which is currently on exhibit, really a marvelous exhibit. I got to see it today. Mr. Forgács's films confront viewers with the human desire to make sense of the mess of history, the jumble of accidents, crimes, lost people, and lost things. This is the jumble of history that Walter Benjamin wrote about in his 1940 Theses on the Philosophy of History. This is a work that he wrote just a few months before committing suicide while crossing over from Vichy France to Spain. Benjamin described a painting by Paul Cleave, probably all seen it. It's called Angelus Novus, and it depicts an angel with his arms spread out wide, and he's looking backwards towards the past. He wants to fix this jumble of history, but there's a storm blowing in from paradise, and his wings are caught in that storm, and all he can do is be thrust backwards towards the future, and mourn this loss of sense, mourn this perpetual chaos that's building up in front of him. In a sense, this question of how we confront the rubble of history is what perplexes all of us, and I'm looking forward to beginning the conversation. So with that in mind, I'll introduce our first speaker, Professor Stephen Zipperstein.
Thank you, Amelia. Let me start with this. I grew up in a home together with my sister Sharon, who's sitting here as well. Oh, they can't hear? Yeah. Oh, closer? Okay. Yeah, I think I've said this before, but I mean, almost invariably, and only when you speak to Jewish audiences are you told that by someone that they can't hear you before you begin to speak. I typically speak to Jewish audiences, and it's more often than to Lithuanians or Poles, and so it's something to actually check out universally, and I'll keep that in mind. So let me again start with this. So I grew up in a home in Los Angeles where my father, a prodigious book. Saying a collector is he bought by the pound, and he bought voraciously. He filled every crevice in the house with books. The garage was transformed into a library. There were beautiful shelves, then mutilated with 5, 6, 7 books to a shelf. So the piles, you couldn't actually know what the books were. After my father's stroke, some 16, 17 years ago, he died about a year and a half ago. We were arranging to donate the library to a university library. I counted 37 copies of Alan Dershowitz's Chutzpah. My father didn't even even like Alan Dershowitz, but apparently when you buy books by the pound, you buy a lot of Alan Dershowitz. But the reason I mention this is for this reason. There's nothing to do with Dershowitz. And but right beside his couch in the living room were some of the books that he most treasured. I tried to put some of mine there. I'm not sure that he put them there voluntarily, but those that he did, and those really featured rather prominently in that he would start to read on Shabbos afternoons. My father was an Orthodox Jew. Were books entitled something like Stranger Than Fiction, and a whole medley of books with titles of that sort. And as all of us know who've lived more than a few moments, the stories around us, the stories that happen around us, the true stories, the extent to which we're able to relate true stories, are so often stranger than fiction. They include stories that I've experienced, indeed, in this very building, stories that if you sought to actually write in a novel and bring to a publisher, the publisher would say, no, this isn't how things happen. Life doesn't happen this way, but we all know that it does. Those of us who write history use the facts of life in ways comparable to the way in which I imagine, though I know nothing about this particular trade, the way in which a builder uses bricks. Facts are bricks, but if you pile bricks high, a building it doesn't make. You just begin with facts. The most torturous, crucial, but torturous part of writing a book is to begin to swim in the material before you know how to use the material. Now, you have to do this. If you don't do this for long enough, the book has no texture, no density. If you do it for too long, then you're in the thicket of writer's block and there's no book. And you somehow have to determine the right balance. When I first came to New York, to YIVO, to that splendid decrepit pile, now a overstuffed museum at the corner of 86th and Fifth, I started work on my dissertation, started reading through newspapers in various languages and other material, and had absolutely no idea what I was going to do with this material. That period lasted for 2-3 months. It felt like several years. I suffered from almost constant insomnia. I ran in Riverside Park. I lived near Riverside Park. I tried every conceivable, all but inconceivable things running through Riverside Park then was for me all but inconceivable. And it just in order to alleviate this discomfort and a period that was simply inescapable, because you can't know how you use the data, but you have to be able to swim in the data. If you impose order on it, on your work too early, then the work suffers. The work could be schematic. If you never impose order, then you don't have a work. And in this respect, the wrestlings of those of us who write nonfiction and those who write fiction, the difference isn't vastly different. We know that the way you begin a book or an article determines, or ought to determine, if you have any sense of architecture, ought to determine something about where it goes. In other words, that first line, that first thought actually is there because you've already determined where it's going to go. You write those first lines last once you know where the book is going. And if you write them first, they almost invariably stumble. So the first set of comments I thought I would just make would be about the relationship between those bricks that are the building blocks of what it is we do when we write nonfiction and the trajectory of a work. And then just a comment or two about leaps. I've found invariably that there are points, no matter how densely documented a work you're writing, there are things you simply cannot explain. And let me give you an example. From one of my books, I wrote a biography of Ahad Ha'am, Asher Ginsburg, the leading figure in liberal Zionism, such as it was, and the architect of the sinews of cultural Zionism. Now, he comes to exert an extraordinary, though somewhat mysterious, charisma on a circle of enormously influential devotees, including Chaim Nachman Bialik, eventually inspires in many ways the Zionism of Gershom Scholem, to some extent Judah Magnus, and continues to be a disturbing presence within Israeli cultural life to the present day. He, as a young man, somewhat privileged, from a rather wealthy Russian Jewish home, his father manages an estate. He goes abroad in 1886 and meets various figures in the Jewish Enlightenment movement and makes no impression whatsoever. None. Those who meet him, passing references to him, absolutely nothing. He runs home very soon afterwards. He misses home. He misses his father. And then in 1888, he moves to Odessa, where he suddenly is described as his pen name that he uses for the first time in 1889 is Ahad Ha'am, which means just one of the people, which ostensibly is a sign of modesty, but this is a massively immodest man, and anyone who reads the Bible in the Jewish tradition knows that you don't only read the Bible, but alongside you read commentaries. And the first time the term Ahad Ha'am is mentioned in Shemot and Exodus, Rashi, the standard medieval commentary, says Ahad Ha'am hamiyuchad ba'am ze hamelech. And so it was a play on words. But be that as it may, in 1886 he basically is deemed undistinguished. In 1888, he's the star of an albeit self-important but nonetheless incredibly intelligent and alert circle in Odessa. What happens? I don't know. I don't know. 2 years can change someone, but change someone that much? How much of it has to do with context? How much of it has to do with circumstance? The place that the proto-Zionist movement that embraces him as a thinker is in, their hunger for some kind of emblem. All those might explain it. None of those explain it sufficiently, and you acknowledge that you cannot figure it out. Or what you engage in is exactly what the artists on this panel engage in, and that is imagination. And without imagination, there is no good historical work. With only imagination, there is no good historical work. And you blend the two, just like at the beginning of one's research, you somehow blend this terrible period of not knowing and amassing, and recognize that it can't last forever, or else you'll work at McDonald's. And the last point I was going to make, and it was going to be a really good point, had to do with the role of the interplay in historical prose between art and historical writing. But I can't make this point because I asked for a copy of one of my books where I wanted to read the last paragraph, and someone has checked it out, and it's sequestered somewhere in the bowels of YIVO, and I can't read from it. But this, nonetheless, points us to another useful lesson that I had to somehow formulate in the last 2 or 3 minutes after I learned that I couldn't read to you from my book, and that has to do with historical contingency. In other words, when you meet someone who tells you that he or she knows history, it's actually usually a he and not a her, and then starts the sentence by saying, "as I always say," basically cross the street, run the other way, that person has absolutely nothing to tell you. But history, what you, as a historian, you have to remain constantly alert. You have to be alert to the role of chance, of absolute contingency, to planning an incredibly wonderful conclusion and your book being locked away somewhere in the building where you're actually speaking. Writ small, that's what so much of history is made of. People living too long, living in the wrong way, Hitler not being admitted to art school, chance. And unless you're alert to that, it seems to me you can't understand the world around you, you can't understand art, you can't understand life, and you certainly can't write history. Thank you.
Thank you. Boris Fishman.
Hi, everyone. Sure. Thank you for having me. It seems necessary to say that I think historians can be artists, and artists also must be historians in a way. Fiction, as you all know, is about showing rather than telling. So I'm going to reserve some of my ideas on the subject of the panel until we talk. I'm just going to show you how history becomes fiction. I always try to do the opposite, because after every reading, the first question that you're asked is, does anybody know? The first question. Yes, refund her ticket as a prize. Is this autobiographical? And I increasingly resist answering that question, because what does it matter? It all involved a varying level of artifice. But I would like to do the opposite here and tell you how my history became the fiction of this novel. Just to tell you a word about it. It's called A Replacement Life. It's about a young man, a failed writer, who starts forging Holocaust restitution claims for old Russian Jews in Brooklyn. And it seems also important to mention, considering the subject of the panel, that this came true. I started writing in 2009. About a year later, I had already finished my first draft. There was a big article in the Times announcing that a fraud that had been sort of more or less the way that I had described it in the novel is the way that it had gone on in real life. It just had been going on since the 90s. People often ask, were you upset? Was your thunder stolen? But in fact, it was a kind of, admittedly, a sad, doleful, but nonetheless a vindication of the kind of story that I wanted to tell. And it quieted my mother down as well, because the first time that she got wind of what the novel was about, she was very upset, because Russian Jews keep their dirty laundry inside, not outside. Anyway, my grandmother was a Holocaust survivor. And it was very important for me to ask her to find out what she went through before she passed. The problem is that she, even though we managed to leave the Soviet Union in 1988, its shadow never quite left us, because she was in a car accident in the 70s in Crimea, which is a place that everyone knows now. But to me, Crimea means something else to this day, because she had to have a blood transfusion. And the blood that she got resulted in her developing cirrhosis of the liver later in life, and it's what killed her. So in some sense, that place killed her in the end, even though she made it out. So by the time that I became old enough to ask her what she had gone through, she was kind of in her decline. And she was really able to give me only 3 salient details about her time. She was an inmate of the Minsk ghetto, and she managed to escape a month before it was destroyed. So she got out in September 1943, and it was destroyed in October 1943. She told me 3 things. She said, I watched cows for the partisans. She said, we went through a lot of swamps, and when I took off my boots, the skin of my legs came off together with the boots. And the third thing is, she was hiding in a bunker once, and somebody had a baby, and there were German soldiers upstairs, and the baby started bawling. And the baby's mother suffocated the baby so the rest of the people would not be given away. Now, I've since learned that some of these details have been told more than once, and who knows if they're apocryphal, but these were the facts of her history as she gave them to me. I now want to read to you the false narrative of Holocaust suffering that appears in my novel as written by its young protagonist, Slava Gelman, at the behest of his grandfather, who is not a Holocaust survivor, but was evacuated to Uzbekistan, but insists that his grandson do this for him because his wife passed away before she was able to apply for restitution in her name. Tell me about grandmother in the ghetto, Slava said. Oh, grandfather said. She didn't like to talk about it. To either of us, Slava said. Well. I don't know what you want me to say. She was in the ghetto, grandfather said at last. She escaped. She weighed nothing. The partisans lived on potato peels in the woods. They waded through swamps for so long, her skin came off with the boots. They had her run a herd of cows. Cows? Slava said. Cows, I don't know. What else? What else? She watched a woman in a bunker choke her child to death. There were fascists upstairs. The baby was crying, giving everyone away. He summed up. It's not pleasant. Slava cleared his throat. What about her parents? Her father asked her to come back to the ghetto and get them, but her mother said no. Get out, find your sister, don't come back. Her sister had slipped out already. Imagine leaving your parents and they're killed a month later. He paused. That's all I know. She didn't want to talk about it. They were quiet for a minute. Don't tell a single soul, Slava said, meaning that he's going to forge the claim. Who would I tell? Grandfather said. Swear, Slava said. Grandfather swore. Cows. What would partisans who had to hide and move often want with cows? Milk, obviously. Did they slaughter them for food? But why would they have put a 15-year-old city girl in charge of a herd of cows? Punishment? Even anti-fascist partisans had no special fondness for Jews. What else did she do during those days and nights? The weather growing cold, the breastplate of the sky turning a bruised black under its necklace of stars. Night watch? Why not? Yes, he kept going. During the day, she tended cows, and at night, she kept watch for the camp. Take pity on a young girl, Slava imagined an older man who knew her from the neighborhood, appealing to Zelkin, the commander. Zelkin spat. You think there are such things as children and adults in a war? He was respected because he did not take advantage of the young girls the way some other commanders did, so the neighborhood man said nothing further. Sophia Dreitzer, 15, originally of Krasteyanova Street, number 45, then, after being penned in the ghetto, of Vitebskaya, number 111, now of camouflaged Zemlyanka, number 6, if you were counting from the bent birch with the bark like split skin. Not that she used the Zemlyanka overmuch. During the day, she looked after the cows, her thumbs rigid from pulling on teats, and her flanks bruised from the anemic knocks of their hooves. And then she sat up on the outskirts of camp in the crisp night, shivering under someone's threadbare greatcoat, by her side a carbine she would not have known how to use. She slept for an hour or two in the morning after she was relieved, her dreams full of her father, who delivered goods by horse cart before the war, galloping in the dream with enormous blocks of ice, faster and faster because the ice was melting in the hot air of the morning. Her free day was Sunday. She slept all day. One afternoon, several sleepless nights behind her, she nodded off while the cows were grazing a kilometer from camp, ... And here it goes into the actual narrative. Narrative, please describe in as much detail as you can where the subject was during the years 1939 to 1945. I thought I had been asleep for a minute, but when I awoke, the sun had traveled half the arc of the sky. The animals were gone. One of the partisans, a Belarusian named Piotrus, said that because I'd lost the cows, I should be killed. One less mouth to feed, what with no cows to supply the grub. Piotrus was a pariah in Hutorka, his village, because he had gone with the partisans. Most of the Belarusians who had been thrown around by the Russians and Poles for as long as anyone could remember were only too happy to take up with the Germans. But Piotrus was old enough to have watched Russian limbs split off by German machine guns in the First World War. So he went with the partisans. To the villagers, he became a Jew lover, because the partisans sometimes took in Jewish fighters. Piotr couldn't even come back for a meal at his mother's, so he spent all his time thinking of ways to restore his credentials as an anti-Semite. In our unit, we had never had to kill one of our own. We had ambushed a German provisions truck once, the front tires busted by the tines of a pitchfork Lifshitz had spent half the night burying in the dead earth. And we had executed a Belarusian collaborator. He was slurping his tea, a sugar cube still in his teeth, as he crashed to the floor, his parents observing the scene with gloomy resignation. But never one of our own. Zelkin, the commander, Piotrus, and several others were conferring inside the small tent where Avdosia baked bread. I had been placed in a makeshift jail. Tzadik, one of the children we got after the Nazis scattered the Minsk orphanage, was listening in and reporting back to me. Bullets were precious, so the idea of a shooting was dismissed. To build a gallows in the middle of the forest when we might have to move at any moment seemed absurd. As they sat there and pounded moonshine that we had taken from the Belarusian collaborator, there was a distant mooing. They were coming back on their own. I leaped from my seat. Piotrus ran out of his tent, squinting. He fancied himself a big shooter and was always taking aim at things, even a piece of bread, before tearing into it. And then, behind the sluggish mooing of the cows, there was that terrifying sound. It chopped through the air, then stretched like a string of sap. German. In that moment, stupidly, I couldn't help thinking how much like our Yiddish it sounded. I hadn't spoken a word of it since the night I had slipped out of the ghetto. Suddenly, what a stupid thought when your life is about to end, I missed it terribly. Vergedenk die Weg, my father had said before I left. Remember the way. Come back for us. We're young yet. We can work. We can be useful. For the first time in my memory, my mother interrupted him. You go and never come back. Find your sister, stay together. I don't want to see you here again. She was trying so hard to look stern, and I didn't argue because I didn't want to embarrass her. The Minsk ghetto was liquidated 1 month later. Liquidated. What a strange word. It makes me think of a deluge, waters rushing in a stream, clear and cleansing. Every last person was killed. To this day, I can't remember my mother's face clearly. My father's face, I can remember every crease and warp. My mother's face is a blank. The Germans sounded as if they were 100 meters away. 2 of our scouts burst into the clearing where we had made camp, gesturing wildly in the familiar code. Someone pulled the levers out of the contraption that maintained the campfire over a grave-like vault. Several boys got their bodies behind a mound of earth and pushed it into the fire like horses leading the plow. Women were frantically tearing down the wash. In minutes, our entire crew was underground, the Zemlyankas innocent under beds of birch leaves. The Germans, following the cows, passed wide of the clearing. That legend about cows knowing their way home is a bluff. Eventually, there was gunfire and objections from the animals. The blood was jumping out of my heart. Tzadik was crouched against me, his soaked pants cold against my arm. From a nearby tent, I heard the sound of muffled retching. No one emerged until well after nightfall. Streamlets of smoke hissed through the earth where the fire had been. They had never come this close. Some said it was the scouts who needed a reproach, not the cowherd, but most, having lay feet from death for hours, did not much feel like administering it to anyone but the Fritzes. Even Zelkin stood off to the side, smoking queasily. And in this way, I was spared. Some irony, saved by the Germans from being killed by your own. The letter, This New Life, had taken all of 45 minutes. What the Nazis took away, Slava restored. He carried numbers on a pad of paper. Doing this for every person they killed would take 513 years without stopping. Reading over the letter, he felt satisfaction mixed with unease. On the page, it was grandmother, but also not grandmother. He couldn't say why, despite rereading the letter several times. Finally, he gave up, double-checked that it included no references to the applicant's gender, and entered his grandfather's name at the top. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Marci Shore.
Okay, well, I think both Steve and Boris have said various things that I was thinking about mentioning. I would say first that I agree with both of them. Perhaps I'll start them by saying that, like Steve, I see what historians do as very similar to what novelists do. And perhaps I see it this way because I spent a lot of my college education vacillating about whether I should try to become a novelist or a historian. And I was never quite sure, to the end, which way I wanted to go. For me, the difference is in the perhaps seemingly insignificant detail that we're not actually permitted to make things up. And that means that there are moments in the books I've written where I can almost see a scene, and I would love to have that scene, and I can more or less see the contours of it, and I might have some details that I'm fairly certain about that would open it, or some details I'm fairly certain about that would close it. But if I don't have the sources to fill in enough of the details, then I have to resign myself to leaving it out. So there are definitely moments when I feel jealous of novelists. I think if I could only, if I would just have the sources to guarantee me that I was fairly certain of a couple little details here and there. I remember when I was working on my first book, there's one scene that is set, it's a dinner party in a Moscow apartment in the 1930s during the Stalinist terror. And there's a Polish futurist turned communist poet named Bruno Jastrzębski who has been deported from France after having written a kind of wild and fantastical communist of sorts novel, and he arrives in Leningrad as a hero and a revolutionary poet. And this is now the time of the Stalinist terror, so while he's a committed Stalinist and revolutionary poet, he's also terrified that at any moment he could also be purged. And there are some visiting Polish writers in the Soviet Union at this time whom he invites. And the apartment is old, and it's decrepit, and it's dusty, and it's freezing, and it's winter, and there's no heat. But there's this very kind of grandiose and lavish silverware and very expensive china, and the table is sent in a very luxurious fashion, and there's caviar. And one of my graduate advisors, Zepp Gumbrecht, read this chapter, and he said, Marci, I need to be able to see the caviar more clearly. Was it red caviar or black caviar? Was it the small eggs or the big eggs? And I didn't know, but I could see that he was right, that visual detail would really have added a lot to that scene. And if I were a novelist, I could have made it up. But unfortunately, the sources I had did not actually give me access to that information. The sense in which I feel very strongly that what we do is like what novelists do is that constant attempt to evoke in our readers a suspension of disbelief. That's what fiction writers strive for. I think that's what historians strive for. When you open the book, it should transport you into another time and another place where generally you were not. And you should be able to be, if we write well, you should be mentally transported there. And that is a kind of experience of alterity, which is I think the most important thing about what we do, precisely this experience of alterity. And to achieve it is an epistemological problem. And it in some ways is analogous to all sorts of other epistemological problems, which is, how do you get from the subject to the object? How do you get from mind to world, from consciousness to being? How do I know that bottle of water I see is really there and isn't just a projection of my consciousness? How can I get this bridge from my own head to the outside world? How can I ever kind of find some kind of a bridge? I mean, this has been the philosophical problem of modernity. Descartes tries, Kant tries, Husserl Husserl tries, everybody tries. Leszek Kolakowski, says in a series of lectures about Husserl, he said, the problem, the search for epistemological clarity, the search for absolute truth is essentially what makes us human. It involves finding a bridge from our mind to the world. The problem of that bridge, Kolakowski says, is insoluble. There is no magical passage. There's no perfect way to reach the other. Nevertheless, he says, our moral imperative, the imperative of humanity, is that you keep trying. And I think that's what we do when we're writing history. You keep trying to reach the other. You keep trying to give your reader that experience of alterity with as much authenticity as possible, knowing that it will never be perfect. Knowing that you can never completely penetrate that distance between one person and another person, knowing that you can never completely overcome the distance between this world and a past world. Nevertheless, the moral imperative is that we keep trying. Maybe I'll talk for a couple minutes more technically, so to speak, about how I try to go about doing this. I'm going to try to speak now not in a normative or prescriptive way, but just a descriptive way, because I'm not at all convinced that there is only one set of techniques that could affect such an experience of alterity or suspension of disbelief. I think as writers, all of us are constantly searching for ways that we can transport our readers more intensely and more vividly, and that experience of alterity can be more all-consuming. And one kind of plays with different methods here and there. One thing I try very hard to do, and I think Boris would have something to say about this too, is I try very hard to allow my characters to speak, to the extent that I have the sources for that. And that means that I very often try very hard to soften my own voice. Sepp Gumbrecht writes about the German word Stimmung, this kind of mood, as coming from the word Stimme for voice, and how Stimmung is a kind of experience of the voice of the other wrapping itself around you. And I think that's one of the things we try to do. We try to evoke those voices and allow those voices to wrap themselves around the reader. And my sense is often that if I want those voices to reach the reader, I have to soften my own voice so that my own voice, somehow facilitates their voices and doesn't run interference in them. I try very hard to make my characters full-bodied characters. I try very hard to always situate them in time and space as concretely as possible. Those are we could say, the kind of Kantian conditions for the writing of history. Everyone must be situated in time and space. There are no historical sources that exist outside of time and space. Those are the basic conditions. Even when one is writing about ideas, and I write about intellectual history, everything is situated in time and space, and everything is embodied. I think, Steve talks about swimming in the documents, which reminds me of kind of Freud's oceanic feeling. I have this same feeling. There's a kind of communing process that has to take place. You have to go into the archives and commune with the documents. You have to try to feel them as intensely as possible. I was giving a pep talk about this to a graduate student once, who was going to go in the archives in Moscow for the first time, about what it means to commune with those documents and to look at the handwriting and to touch the paper. And she went to one of her other advisors and said, Marci says I have to commune with the documents. Do you commune with documents? And he said, no, I read them, I take notes, I leave. No, but you have to kind of let them wash over you. For me also, it has to be an immersion experience. And the immersion experience is related to another point Steve made that I think is very important for us, which is to always preserve that sense of contingency against the teleological temptation of retrospect. It's very, very hard to go back, and project yourself into 1926 and really feel all the possibilities as being open, and try to remove from your mind that you know what happens later. You can never completely do that. You always know what happens later. But I try very hard when I'm writing. If I'm writing about 1926, even if I know I'm working on something that's going to go up to, 1962, I try at the moment I'm writing about 1926 only to look at the material from up to 1926 and not to kind of peek ahead to the material I've gathered for later chapters, because I'm trying to give myself that experience of mentally being in 1926, which is, of course, totally imperfect. It never completely works. When I was working on my master's thesis in Toronto in the 1990s, I was writing about Czech and Slovak writers during the Stalinist period, and how they created in Czech for themselves a Stalinist language. And one of the things I did at the time, which I could do because I didn't have children or dogs or other responsibilities, is I would go to the library and I'd go to the microfilm room in the morning. And first of all, I stopped watching the news. I stopped listening to the news. I stopped reading the newspapers. I stopped looking at anything that might remind me that it was 1996 and I was living in Toronto. And instead I would go to the library and I would go to the microfilm room and I would read the Czechoslovak daily newspaper, the communist daily newspaper from around 1952 at the time of the Rudoslavsky trial. And I wasn't actually directly using any of that material from the newspaper in what I was writing. But I wanted to wake up and put in my head what would be in my head if I were in Prague in 1952. And at a certain moment, I felt like I crossed a line, and I felt like in some way I was there. I was mentally there, like that world had become real to me. It was never a perfect experiment. I was never really hallucinating. If pressed, I could tell you it was 1996 and I was in Toronto. But I tried really, really hard to only surround myself with that material, so it would be a total immersion experience. I try to use unexpected details. I think I was influenced here by Viktor Shklovsky and Ostranenia and estrangement, or making strange. Something about language should disrupt our automated perception of things. It should kind of wake us up and cause us to see things in a way we haven't seen them before. I was influenced by Chekhov. There's a famous fragment of a letter that Anton Chekhov writes to his publisher in 1888. Where he says, "It seems to me it is not for writers of fiction to resolve questions such as those of God, pessimism, and the like. The writer's business is simply to describe who has been speaking or thinking about God or about pessimism, how and in what circumstances. The artist should not be the judge of his characters and what they speak about, but only an impartial witness. I heard a confused conversation of two Russians about pessimism, a conversation resolving nothing. And I should convey that conversation in the very form in which I heard it. The jury, that is the readers, will decide its value. My business is simply to be talented. That is, to know how to differentiate the important from the unimportant, to cast light on the characters and to speak their language." And I think, and this is something that for historians is quite controversial. It has to do with muting my voice. Whereas I don't intervene normatively at moments when I think many readers would like me to intervene normatively, and make a clear case about who is good and who is bad and what was right and what was wrong. And I try to be very restrained, because I want readers to have that experience of being present in the past. Let me speak maybe briefly in the last couple minutes a little bit about my last book, The Taste of Ashes, which is a very personal book, in some sense a very deeply voyeuristic and exploitative book. It's a book about guilt. In many ways, it's a book about the presence of the past of the 20th century in the post-communist era. It's a book about the entanglement of the Nazi past and the Stalinist past and the communist past. It's a book about the guilt of historical protagonists and the moral ambivalences of the historian. It's a book about the point Hegel makes, that actions not only occasionally, but more often than not have consequences in excess of their intentions. That there were historical moments in which there were no innocent choices to be made, in which people were forced to make decisions in conditions in which all decisions involved a betrayal of someone or something, and all decisions caused suffering. Nevertheless, one had to choose. And how then does one grapple with that legacy? It's a book also influenced by Wilhelm Dilthey's idea that understanding, Verstehen in that very large German sense, comes through what he calls Nacherleben, which is a kind of vicarious re-experiencing. And that we should write in such a way that enables the reader to experience, what the people we write about were going through. And my last book, in some sense, was an attempt to lay bare the process of what it means to try to do that and the moral dilemmas involved in doing that. It's also a book about individuals. There's a Polish philosopher named Stanislaw Brzezowski who dies of tuberculosis at the age of 33 before he can really do anything terribly morally problematic. And he writes in his diary, "What is not biography is nothing." And that's also been an impulse that if we lose the sense that we're not just writing about institutions or ideas or parties or movements, we're always writing about people. History is always about people, and if we lose that sense that we're writing about the experiences of people, then we've lost the essence of what we're doing. That cultivation of that experience of alterity, I would say, is possible only through that kind of vicarious re-experiencing that involves a kind of empathy. And that empathy comes with two moral risks. The first risk is the risk of moral relativism, which has to do with the normative restraint. What does it mean to write about people who did terrible things and to try to understand them? If our job is to try to understand them, then we have to try to make an empathetic leap. And that always comes with the risk of moral relativism. And the second moral risk is that the kind of empathy that truly allows our readers that experience of alterity is inevitably based on voyeurism. What historians do is we read other people's diaries. We read other people's letters. We read letters that were never meant for us to see. We read letters that should have been burned. We read letters that the letter writer pleaded with the person that she was writing to please burn the letters. And that person betrays her by not burning them, and we are the beneficiaries of that. And that voyeurism then becomes the precondition for what we do. Let me maybe read you a very brief example. I'll read you a very brief example from a text I'm working on now, which is a kind of intellectual history of the Maidan, of the Ukrainian Revolution. And this is about a Ukrainian translator and psychoanalyst named Yurko Prohasko. From Krakow, Yurko went on to Vienna. And it was there that he learned of the first deaths and battle on the barricades on Hrushevsky Street, the Armenian Sergei Nigolyan and the Belarusian Mikhail Zhunyoitsky. Yurko found it unbearable to be in Vienna then. In Ukraine, people were dying, and he was in Vienna. He wanted only one thing, to go home. He returned to Lviv just at the moment when the body of Yuri Verbitsky was found in the woods. On the Maidan, a police stun grenade had blown fragments into Verbitsky's eye. Another activist brought him to the hospital, and from the hospital, both men were kidnapped, taken to a forest, and brutalized. Verbitsky's body, battered and frozen, was found the following day. Verbitsky had never been a radical. He was a 50-year-old physics professor who researched tectonic movements of the earth. Yurko began to prepare for a longer stay in Kiev. Everyone understood that in Lviv there was nothing to be done. The whole city, even the mayor, was on the side of the revolution. In Lviv, everything had already been won. There was a consensus: women, children, and the elderly should stay, but men with any strength should go to Kiev. It was around the time of the Christian holiday of Epiphany, and Yurko's family was invited by his son's godmother's family for lunch. Their host had invited as well the godparents of their own children, who arrived in tears. The woman had been Yuri Verbitsky's first wife. They had divorced years earlier. She had remarried. He had not. The adults sent the children to play in another room. Even so, Yurko's older son, at 11 years old, was too old not to understand. Verbitsky's funeral had taken place in Lviv just 3 days earlier. And when we come home, Yurko told me, My older son, the one who painted the banner that first evening, comes to me with tears in his eyes and says, "Daddy, you have to promise me that you'll never again go to Kiev to the revolution. Tell me, yes or no." And I'm convinced that I have to do this, that I have to go, and who if not me and everyone together? But on the other hand, a child is crying and looking into your eyes and waiting for an answer and saying, "Tell me that you will never, ever go there again." And I said, "Yes, I promise you, I won't go there anymore."
Thank you. Well, I think these thoughts about voyeurism and Stimmung are a wonderful segue to Péter Forgács.
Well, I just wanted to continue right on this voyeurism because collecting home movies or working from archive film is very much the same. And I'm happy to be in this company because I'm more the man of images and music than words. So I can relax because everything was told. And more to that, I have my image and sound exposed in the museum, city of New York, so I'm relaxed, but all day I was really under the great pressure. What can I say? What can I say if I did my job? But of course, this is an illusion because we have to talk about these very important things that Boris just told how the mother choked his own kid, baby, and then I just covered my eyes. And this is how I could make this exhibition that you will see or saw already, that I had to cover my eyes and just like you, go into that period and not think what has happened after 1939, September the 1st. I closed my inside eyes and didn't do anything to go beyond that date because otherwise I thought that I can't do this. And this goes to this great big problem of representation. Of course, the same guys who filmed the same American Polish Jews who went back in the mid-war period to Poland. There was a few, of course, because not many people could afford this big travel. And even of those, not many had film cameras. And even of those, we didn't receive all the films. But we know too much about life, or less, or not enough. But the point is that these filmmakers, when they visit from the new world to the old world, they have this spontaneous or amateur anthropological visit to the past. They come from a city where electronic connection, machines, communication, books, traffic, civilization is somewhere 100 years up ahead. What does it mean up ahead? Okay, it's different. It's a different cluster. But when they go back to Poland, they can film so intimate things that they wouldn't do with their own neighbors. Just imagine that you live in the suburb over here, and then you go with your camera and go to your neighbor when he's eating, you know? Or even a passenger on the boat going back. You can't just go there and film that they're eating or dancing. You have to have the permission. Not talking about today's restrictions, of course, and copyright and personal rights and my identity, don't steal it, etc. So the collection of YIVO, in this case, was not a novelty for me as home movie, but it was novelty because these people wanted to show for those people back in the States what has happened, how they look like, how did they use the money, we helped them, or just show Yasha how Yitzhak looks like today. But this representation is something very, very interesting because it's mixed up with two very important things. The filmmaker knows what will be the result. Most of the filmed people don't know how a projected cinema or home movie would look like. So the self-representation was restricted to photography and journals. And from that on, we are really surprising from one second to another, from one sequence to another, how complex the life of the Jews in Poland was. How detailed. We heard that, we read that, but seeing it with those little fractions, little miniature facial movements, how they pump in from the well, what they look like, how they talk, how they behave. You know, it's a great surprise. And as the surprise touched me in 1983 when I started to collect home movies in Hungary, then I established a little archive, private photo and film archive, which still stands on its collection of 100,000 photographs of the past and about 600 hours of amateur films, different families, Christians and Jews. And this is the only correction in hyphens I would add to you, Stephen. I'm not talking about Jews and Poles, but I'm talking about Christians and Jews. So when we're talking about, they were Polish citizens, aren't they? So they are not Jews and the others Poles, but I think they were considering themselves Jews of Poland. So this is a little bit distinguishing between Poles and Jews. It's better to use Christians and Jews. They both, I mean, it was one country, whatever. But why I'm saying it, because this is the devilish shadow over Hungary at the moment. At the moment, we have a very dark phase of history. And it's partly because my country never really faced the past. How did they participate, the Hungarian population, civil authorities, gendarmeries, in the deportation? They were not the Nazis who deported 500,000 Jews to Auschwitz. It was the Hungarian civil servants, gendarmerie, etc. And now they tell us that it was the Germans' sin. Now, this makes me very, very creative in talking about the Polish Jews, because there it's easier, though we know what neighbors can do to each other. We have that wonderful book about Polish Gross, yeah, Jan Gross. What I want to say that collection of home movies are communicating something very, very personal, because they don't talk or pretend or behave or communicate to a camera, but to a person behind the camera. It's something very, very direct and emotional. Even the refusal of getting in contact, hiding their face. If you will see the beautiful colored pictures, colored Eastman Kodak shootings in Warsaw, 16 millimeter. I mean, it's just crazy how vivid life we had there. We had. You see? I'm in my own trap, because it's nice to be clear about that. They and me. But it's all, as you said, it's mixed up really, because you want to distance yourself from your present time, but you cannot really. Because when I'm composing this exhibition or a film, it's clear that I am here in my present time, and I have to say something with them, through them. But I have to withdraw my horses and not run too forward by giving the meaning to it. I have to leave you, the viewer, to put the story together. Because these amateur ethnographers filmed so many interesting things, and that's why the title became Letters to Afar, because they are visual letters, but even, I could say, diaries. As you pointed out well, that we are spies in reading others' private letter where the last line was, "Please burn it, Franz Kafka." We're happy that his manuscripts were not burned. You know, we're lucky.
He probably didn't mean it.
Now, this is the point where we don't know anything. Zero. I think we don't know anything what the other feels, and this is really something I wanted to just share with you. I made a film in 1991 based on Ludwig Wittgenstein, the Viennese philosopher's writings, and I made a video essay. You can imagine how difficult it is to put together with this strict Wittgensteinian world collage, but I tried it. And there I used quotes from his Vermischte Bemerkungen, which is on culture and value in English, and his Tractatus. And one of the sentences that is still inspiring me, he writes, "How hard I find it to see what is right in front of my eye." It's really hard, and all the time when I was composing these stories, I was really thinking, how dare I am touching it? How dare I am commenting it? But there is a need to unveil something, go into the bush, understand all the things that are given, and it's really, as you said, swim. I love that metaphor, swimming in the material, until there is something that calls to work out a different language, a language for this subject. And I'm really lucky because you had to read your book, but I don't know where everybody read your book or not. I would recommend it, though. But this is the part of advertisement, because it was strong. And this is what I lack. I mean, the strength of prose. So I go with others. I serve them. I pull back my horses. I really try to slow down time and space while observing. And I try not to give the meanings. I try to give it as an offering. As an offering, right now, it's your time to understand it. And why I'm saying it? Well, this is really not easy, but I never considered myself as a Holocaust filmmaker. I don't have any film where you see people directly killed. I always talk about things before or after, because I agree on some terms with Adorno that it's hard to talk about it. Of course, it's not end of the poetry, but it's, do we have words to describe that? No, I don't think so. And I really see the heroic and beautiful attempts like Jean Amery or Imre Kertész or Borowski, the Polish Christian, who gave us so many things by understanding that big black hole which came on us. And when I think about Wittgenstein, I also think about, should things happen like it happens like that? He says precisely, everything we see could be also otherwise. Everything we can describe at all could be also be otherwise. So I try to think beyond this catastrophe of 1939, September the 1st, and give a chance to the unknown, to give a chance to go beyond statistics. 3 million people killed. I can't say anything about after that. But if I look at these people on the films in Łódź, in Warsaw, in Krakow, then you feel that there is a very, very simple bridge you can go beyond. And that's why I think art and history writing are brothers and sisters.
Thank you. Thank you all for those comments, which weave together in many important ways. I want to start the conversation off with a question that all of you have touched upon a little bit, and I incidentally had a conversation yesterday with my colleague at UC San Diego, a colleague who's trained in cultural history and who has switched gears and is now writing a historical novel. And she continues to do archival research, but it's for fiction. And she was talking to me about the ethics involved in that, and that as a historian, she feels it's her job to write a novel that remains historically true, if false in the details, and that there is a very strong ethics. And I think, Boris, in particular, your novel certainly gets at this, because you have this very thin story, thin on fact, that keeps getting retold in different ways as your protagonist tries to hold it up to different lights and, allow different people to wear it. And so I'm wondering if each of you could comment from your own perspectives about how the rules change about facts for your individual disciplines. The rules about truth.
Well, just one example about how slippery facts are. I didn't use the word Jews and Poles. Jonathan did. And so I'm not being defensive. It's a really interesting test case in how difficult it is to reconstruct the very, very, very recent past. And it's an illustrative point. It's we all know how difficult it is when we leave a dinner party to actually reconstruct what happened with our loved ones. And here's a perfect example. And so what we do is we dig into, what are archives really? They're just the shavings of what it is that fell from a desk and then someone put in a folder. The notion that you reify archives because they're the only source of truth is absurd. What are they? And so you just look around and try to gather every conceivable thing possible in order to dig into that thing that happened, with a recognition that it's so incredibly hard that 15 minutes after Jonathan Brent uses the term Poles and Jews, my friend Peter turns to me and reminds me that they're Jews and Christians, and you're absolutely right. So it's a wonderful example. It really is a wonderful example.
He's an artist, so the rules are different.
I want to ask. Now, I want to ask about that. I saw Peter's installation. I think it's stunning, absolutely stunning. But what I wonder was, as I was sitting there in that room, moving from screen to screen, it was impossible for me not to think about two simultaneous thoughts, and that was the ethnographic aspect of it. In other words, what it was that these particular people, somewhat moneyed with machinery, were reconstructing. What were they dwelling on? What were they not dwelling on? And then I know, as I was watching it, I couldn't but think, these people are dead. Now, I understand, I entirely agree with Marci that when we write about 1926, we're writing about 1926, but God knows, we know about 1943 and 44. Now, in putting this together, it's hard for me to imagine that when you zeroed in on those elderly women, on those grandmothers, you weren't thinking something of the same thought and how that influenced you. Just one other question to Boris. Is there something intrinsically worse about lying about the Holocaust than lying about other things? The Wilkomirski case is a perfect example. Had he published that as a novel, he would no longer he wouldn't be hanging out, hiding in that farmhouse where he's going to live for the rest of his life with a book that now is it feels as pornographic as, I don't know, a copy of Hustler. And he wrote those words. Those words were extraordinary. Those words are now deemed filthy. And so did you
Yes.
think about Wielkomirski as you were writing?
Not about Wielkomirski, but there is a real problem with messing around with Holocaust history when it is so vigorously contested and denied and downplayed by so many people in the world. The alternative, the opposing view, very briefly, is that the books that I read about the Minsk ghetto to find out what my grandmother could not tell me were hard to read. They were academically reliable, I don't doubt, but they were hard to read. Intellectually reliable, factually reliable, but they were hard to read. I don't know how many people have read this book, but I'll venture to say that it's an easier thing to pick up for a lot of people than is one of those. For me, the problem with invention begins when it starts to become spiritually false to the material. But what does that mean? I mean, that's in the eye of the beholder. The other issue that's very relevant, which could form the subject of another panel, is what are readers prepared to read about? Who here knows King of the Jews by Leslie Epstein? Which came out in '79. I mean, the book caused an uproar because it dared to portray the chairman of the Judenrat in the ghetto as an ordinary sinner. I really wanted to write a book about Jews behaving badly. But maybe they're behaving badly in the name of a larger justice. But even if they're not, Jews are allowed to behave badly and still live. They are ordinary sinners like anyone else. To write fiction that commemorates them as nothing but saints denies them their humanity. In order to tell some of these stories, well, there's no reason that history cannot do the same thing. It's equally on history. The problem there is with audience rather than with the cultural producers. But at the same time, I think the audience is becoming ever more sophisticated. The kind of uproar that we saw in response to Portnoy's complaint or to King of the Jews, I'm not putting my book in the same league as those, but I speak in front of lots of Jewish audiences, and I've never heard one objection to how could you, in the manner of how could you, which is highly encouraging to me. Because survivors are dying, and we have to come up with new forms of commemoration. We have to figure out how to talk about the Holocaust, because we're about to enter the first generation of people who will have no access to live survivors. How do you tell those stories? I think the best history moves people in absolutely the same ways that art does, absolutely on the same level. And terrible fiction moves no one. As you said, Peter, I think they must absolutely work together. Because I move away from the facts so much in this narrative, it's a really dangerous book if there isn't also history about the facts portrayed within it to read it alongside. They have to be read in tandem. They have to hold hands.
Peter, I'd asked you a question or two. It had nothing to do with either Poles or Jews.
Could you repeat the question? Because it's so interesting to dwell into.
That's what you, as you were doing this, I mean, to what extent were you preoccupied with this ethnographic character? But perhaps more importantly, to what extent could you really excise from your mind as you were editing, as you were dwelling on certain figures, as you were perhaps also mourning? To what extent, in other words, could you truly excise mourning from it?
Well, it's a very important question. I didn't say I didn't think about it. I didn't read about it. I tried to not to read what has happened and not to look films, because the power and the real intriguing problem for me to solve when I started this work is that this is a Hitchcockian scene. It's like the suspense of Hitchcock, that you see people, villages, lands, houses, children, and you know, these are the victims and these are the place of the crime. Crime scene. You know who kills, you know their future, they don't know it. You, the viewer, as in a good Hitchcock film, you know, oh my God, let's tell them, hey, Rear Window, oh yeah, I want to tell the girl that it's dangerous, you know, it's vertigo, you know, it's, oh, don't get into that, that woman is not real, you know, and how he wakes up, you know, in Vertigo, Stuart, I mean, it's just crazy. So what I thought is that, yes, I'm here, I'm looking at landscapes, streets, shtetls, babies, old people, young people, and this is a Hitchcock film. And as detailed this scene, place, music, emotional impact, which is not sentimental, this is the #1 rule. Don't be sentimental. Just go distance yourself, because we have all the interpretations and negations and big discussions between Spielberg and Lanzmann, you know? Show it or not show it. Show the little girl in the red coat or not show it, you know? Two great artists, but two different philosophies. So I go with Lanzmann. I go with Lanzmann because I have this Hitchcockian situation that I see all my father's family there who have been killed, except for 4. So I had a second uncle living in Vienna who visited us in 1956 for coming from Ukraine. That was a miracle to come out Soviet Russia. And for a few months he was staying with us, and he was a painter. And then he moved out to Austria in 56 when the borders were open. And he wrote me, I visited him regularly. He lived a very long life. 96, he passed away at age 96. And he wrote me down that 74 of our family, the Friedmans and Rosenbergs, were killed. We have the date because transporting from, you know, Randall, Braham, etc. So I didn't want to think of them, but they were always present, you know. Black and white film, smiling babies, young people, bicycling, etc., etc., etc. So this paradox, this Hitchcockian paradox, was heavy, but also it was a duty, you know, because I knew that I have to praise life. I have to give back their faces. I have to give back their names. I have to call them, because this is what we are for. This is what I am for. And the biggest problem of this film language is don't be sentimental. Never, never, not for a second. I don't want to show my emotions, because I don't want to rule the place and the space of your emotions as a visitor. I have to create a vacuum, an empty Beckettian place where you go in and feel that these are parallel universes and they are always living. From now on, they will live.
I'd like to just jump in and ask, sort of overlay another question for us to think about before we open it up to the general discussion. Yeah, well, precisely, yeah. Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. No, I was in fact going to draw on that, and we were sort of talking about that. You have these multiple screens operating in parallel, so that you almost are, as we were saying, I think before the panel began, living in a world where there's Lodz and there's Vilna and there's this shtetl here and there's this shtetl over here, and life is going on in all of them, but you can't be in all places at the same time. Yeah. But you're aware of this parallelism, and that actually kind of leads me to a question that I wanted to overlay, which is. Your installation is about bridging space as well as bridging time. And in your installation, rather than the past just being a foreign country, it's sort of like the foreign country is a past, is the past for many of your filmmakers, these Americans going back from their modernity. And I'm wondering, for all of you, whether you feel that the two sometimes become confused. Is there a way in which, all of you work on Eastern Europe, is there a way in which Eastern Europe becomes confused with history, Eastern Europe's presence, and you need to somehow tease those two out?
Does the Eastern Europe's past become conflated with
Its present.
Well, in my case, one of the problems with invention is that you forget what was real. I wanted to memorialize the experiences of some of the people I grew up among. Not that this book will make them immortal or anything, but okay, they'll live a little bit longer than they would have had they stayed inside those people's minds, where those people tried to keep them really hard. The price that I paid is I often no longer remember what really happened and what didn't. Even as I sat here and told you that my grandmother told me about cows, in that moment I sincerely believed it. But as I was reading, I'm like, I think I actually invented that. I don't think she told me that. The third detail was actually about her family and the people who were killed and what they said to her. You see? And this is why I said it's so important to read fiction alongside history, is because, I mean, not in the case of personal narratives, though that forms historical repositories as well, but so you can go back and check what was fact, because I've lost grasp of it. And as I turn it over to you, I wanted to add the name Roman Vishniak to this discussion, which is surely a name familiar to all of you. I mean, talk about an artist altering the historical record in order to suit certain notions had of the region elsewhere. For those of you who don't know the story, you guys can probably speak to it better than I can. But if anybody wants to comment on that, I'd be very curious to hear your thoughts on that. Basically, Roman Vishniak made Eastern European Jews look falsely poor in order to attract more funding from American Jews. That's putting it very reductively. He was an amazing photographer who did a morally dubious thing.
Yeah, well, I don't want to really, because for me, Vishniak was really a kind of pillar, a light in the darkness, you know. Basically because I'm coming from a middle-class Jewish family where my father said, okay, some of our forebears were working on fields, so I could see Vishniak's heroes. But the fact is that Vishniak at least shed some light on those who have been perished. And the truth of the matter is that we have to understand each time when we see these pictures, and you're right, because in this exhibition you see how varied, how layered was the Jewish society, and
also how diverse in terms of observance and religiosity. I mean, religious people lived next to non-religious people.
Yeah.
How often do we see that today?
Of course, and this really calls for greater and deeper studies of, for example, the publications of Jewish communities in the mid-war period. I mean, I think the new exhibition in Warsaw will drive you to the depth of these wonderful discoveries that Barbara Kirschenbach-Gimblett and her small army did in a wonderful way. But what I want to say is the meaning of the picture, and this is very, very difficult. You know, you have your grandmother's thoughts, you have description of the Minsk ghetto, but when you see a photograph, you don't have doubts because it was there. You know the date, you know the place, you maybe know the persons, but do we know really what is in their people's mind you see in the photograph?
She's an unreliable witness to what it was. She's a reliable witness to how it felt.
Yes, but putting together now these two experiences, my feelings and the facts that are on these amateur films, you suddenly know something more than before. And this is what, also let me quote Wittgenstein again, 2.224 of Tractatus. It cannot be discovered from the picture alone whether it's true or false. And that is true. You see a young woman sitting on a bench in a black and white photograph, and you know how long the post-First World War fashion lasted until the mid-60s. So you can say that from 1925 to 1964, certain women dresses were the same. So you see a black and white photograph, a young woman on a bench, and you have this photograph, the same photograph 5 times, but different titles. Unknown photograph, the daughter of Goering, the sister of Stalin, the cousin of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, you know. And you have to go and it's not the question of true and false, but it's the human praxis, the avant-gardist praxis that take away the meaning, add the meaning, recontextualizing. These films, what I have used to build up this exhibition is false. The whole thing is a fiction, you know. It's a story. There's nothing there, nothing of the truth, because the truth is borning in your mind. You, the visitor, will know the truth. I don't know it.
Yeah, if I could just add to what Peter said. I think the point about avoiding sentimentality is important. That I feel like there's a need for constant restraint to give space to the readers. And I feel that all the time, like that constantly you have to be very self-disciplined about pulling back to give that space to the reader so that they can have that experience. And I think, it sounds like, I think you must have been grappling with this, especially in this installation, in a way that I'm constantly obsessed with, which goes back to your question about ethics, that what we do is deeply invasive, and that the violation of intimacy is the precondition for understanding. And there is no way out to that problem. These were private films. These were things that people made for themselves and their families, that if you asked them all, did they want hundreds or thousands of people, of strangers, of living in a different time or different place, to see their relatives, to see their children, to see what their wife was wearing, many of them might have been very unhappy about it. But yet, in some sense, in order to restore their humanity in full, we have to violate that, and that dilemma where...
Violation in quotation marks, not directly. So we don't violate ethically, but we violate in a way that reconstructs it. Am I understanding you well?
I think what we do is a hazy ethical line. I think it's a violation of intimacy that is the precondition for our empathy and our understanding. I don't know that there's a way out of that dilemma. I think we are always working within that dilemma.
Just one brief comment, and I know we want to open up. I agree with everything you say about sentimentality, but at the same time, one shouldn't collapse sentimentality and tenderness. And in my reading, one of the most pronounced features of Boris's book that very much distinguishes it from at least my recent reading of other post-Soviet Jewish fiction that occasionally, more than occasionally, typically feels anarchic, feels almost as if it was written on speed, is the, and reviewers have commented on this, and I think Boris has talked about this in interviews, is the Bernard Malamud-like feel to the novel, which is also, and the quote in the frontispiece is a really revealing one, and he means it to be revealing. All writing is revenge. It's this is an attempt to memorialize a grandmother, Slava's grandmother, perhaps a grandmother who looks a bit like Boris's grandmother, but it's an incredibly tender book. And so I think it's important to underline that tenderness isn't the same as sentimentality. And there's an pronounced tenderness, it seems to me, that it pervades your installation. And I think you explicated the underpinnings of that very, very beautifully tonight.
I think you've nicely summed up some of the reasons that the four of you were perhaps the obvious choices for this particular panel, because all of you do engage so, can I say, tenderly with your subjects. I want to open it up right now to questions that you may have from the audience. And perhaps introduce yourselves as you stand up to ask. If you don't mind. You don't have to. It's okay. Kitsch.
The other point I want to make, I'm glad you mentioned hello? Okay. The Vilkomirski, because one of the things that struck me when that thing came out and then the scandal was I've been listening to Holocaust survivors' accounts for God knows how many years. And it occurred to me that what was going on, especially as the years went by, was an aestheticization of the story. So that in fact, knowing all the facts that I knew and I could make up my own Holocaust narrative and sell it. But then a very interesting thing happened. I cleaned up my study, which is not usual. And in a pile of papers, I came across a manuscript of fragments with a letter from, what was his name, Arthur Cohen, who was then at Schocken, saying, I'm sending you this, let me know what you think of this Bildungsroman. I don't know where it got translated from a Bildungsroman to a factual narrative. Because as far as...
It's Arthur Samuelson.
Arthur Samuelson, yeah. So it was sent to me as to look at as a Bildungsroman. And as I say, I don't know at what point it morphed into fact. But I think it's an interesting case of the issue of the aestheticization of the stories.
Does anyone want to comment on that at all, this sort of the genre categorization, or shall we let a few people ask questions and then comment?
I'd like to bring up the subject of I'm Deborah Woroff. I'd like to bring up the caviar. The trend in modern historic writing, and especially people like Doris Kearns Goodwin, is more and more when you don't have an actual description of so-and-so had dinner with me and this is what his caviar was like. You sort of fill it in by saying at that point in time, Warsaw's caviar came from Odessa, and it was principally of the beluga variety, which was always a little bit gray, and you go with that. And I think, on the one hand, that's giving people more experience of what 80% probability was the reality. But on the other hand, you don't have absolute confidence, and maybe you shouldn't present it on the paper where it does have 100%. And I just wonder what you two historians would say.
You know more about caviar than I do. I know perhaps more about Odessa. So why don't you start?
I mean, that's a constant judgment call we're making that each of us constantly has to make for ourselves. When we are confident enough in our sources that we present something as having been the case. I do feel like when I'm writing, it's my job to make the executive decisions. As opposed to saying, well, maybe, or maybe perhaps, or it could have been this way, or it could have been that way. that might be intellectually honest, but that breaks the suspension of disbelief. I don't like intervening with my narrative to remind, the reader so much that, I'm having these problems with sources, unless I'm writing specifically on that topic, my problems with sources. But if I'm trying to tell a story, it's my job to tell the story. And we constantly have to make that call. I mean, there are memoirs that I use, and there are memoirs that I read and think, no, I don't think it's reliable. We're constantly we never have all the pieces of the puzzle. We rarely have 100%, but we're always trying to put together the pieces that we have and try to glean the contours of the pieces that are missing. And if it's not 100%, but if it's more than 50%, we, each of us for ourselves, I think, have to make that decision when we feel certain enough to present it as being the case. And I rarely intervene in the, well, it was probably. I generally, either I'm quite confident I know and I tell it like a novelist, or I think, no, I'm just not sure, and I leave it out.
Yeah, there's Chekhov, who Marci mentioned before, of course, dreamed about writing long fiction, and Tolstoy dreamed about writing short fiction. There's a certain jealousy that historians feel for novelists, but there's a marvelous astringency about the fact that we could only use facts, and we cleave to that. I think my sister has left, and so I will say this. I think that part of what has cleaved me to history is growing up in a home where at least one of my parents engaged constantly in incredibly flamboyant stories made almost entirely a fantasy, which meant that for me, there was very little allure for postmodernism. I grew up in the belly of postmodernism, and I didn't want anything of it. And so there was something profoundly appealing about learning a discipline, and I'm not an empiricist, but learning a discipline where at least the goal is to be as factual as possible. So I probably would have written the same sentence as Marci did about caviar. And so that would be my answer to your question.
Yeah, I know that you're talking about creation of history and art, but Boris said you have to have both together. And I wanted to ask the historians, not separate from your writing as teachers, when you feel you really need to supplement history with art or literature in your teaching, when you feel the history isn't enough.
Oh, I do that all the time. Definitely. I use poetry. I use novels. I've used film. I mean, it's often the case that I want students to feel a certain atmosphere, to make a certain leap that I think is most effectively conveyed by fiction. I think it was either Peter or Boris mentioned Tadeusz Borowski, This Way for the Gas, ladies and gentlemen. I mean, I think those are probably the best stories ever written about Auschwitz. They're unbearable. And I used them for a long time. I say, after I gave birth to my son, I could no longer bear it, because I couldn't bear rereading him. But precisely for that reason, I think those are the best. And certainly some of the most effective material I've used in my classes to convey historical understanding to my students have been works of fiction.
Yeah, I mean, I do the same thing, but I think in addition, perhaps especially since I teach in the midst of Silicon Valley at Stanford, visual knowledge. I teach students who've come to learning immeasurably more through visual knowledge than I did. My task isn't to look down at them because they came to knowledge differently than me and to act as if everyone ever since Moses came to knowledge in the same way as me, which is an attitude I think perhaps shared silently or not by some of my colleagues. There are many sources of knowledge. Beethoven understood too, and he came to knowledge in ways different than those of us who are textually obsessed. So it seems to me my task as someone who remains alert in teaching students as bright as my students are, is to be able to teach them, which means to understand how they acquire their knowledge and to sit with them and to be able to transmit the knowledge that I know. So I certainly use novels, but increasingly the kind of visual knowledge that I can't create, but I could try to learn about its underpinnings and then use it for pedagogical purposes.
We're going to take a couple more questions.
Thank you. I'm Adele Silver. I'm not a historian, but I'm the widow of a historian of the medieval period.
And who's a very dear friend of mine. It's wonderful to see you.
And he loved you too. You're talking, of course, about a period that at least some of us lived through and most of us have read about. Does any of it apply to somebody who's writing about the 12th century, the 16th century? How, and if so, how? I'd love to hear that.
It's a tough question for the end of the evening, Adele. You want to?
Well, I was just going to. I mean, it's interesting. The panel is, of course, made up of modern historians and artists of this modern moment. But I would argue as a literature scholar that it does apply because literary texts about the medieval period are very different from historical texts. And the medieval period is one that we love to fantasize about. I mean, there's a whole, genre of fantasy play about the medieval period, this idea of the medieval. So I think many of us who work on the modern period, whether in literature or history, tend to envy medievalists a bit because they know everything that was written and they're accountable for absolutely everything that was written. And those of us who work on the modern period will never feel completely comfortable that we've gotten to absolutely every text out there. So it may be easier to say whether something is at least provable fact or fiction when you're dealing with an earlier period.
If we're moving toward the end, let me just share a very quick story that has to do with visual knowledge. And Adele Silver's husband, Daniel Silver, a very, very great student of Jewish thought. My two boys are adopted at birth. And we got a call. I was then teaching in Oxford, and Daniel happened to be visiting that term. We got a call from our adoption lawyer in Kansas while I was away giving a talk to a room full of scholars that Daniel was in. And we had only one car. We were living on an Oxford lecturer salary. And my then wife was home with actually Yuli Tamir, who later became the Minister of Education under Barak's government and is now in political exile. And so Yuli walked into the lecture hall where I was giving the talk, and with a note in Sally's hand saying, "It's good news, but end the lecture." And I then turned to Yuli and I said, was it the adoption lawyer? And she shook her head. And as I looked at the room, the face I looked at was Daniel's. And I associate to this day news of the birth of my first son with Daniel Silver, your husband. And so there you talk about the power of visual knowledge. And so I thought it'd be perhaps a good way of ending the evening. Do you think so?
Maybe it's Bergson's spool folding back on itself.
or perhaps
Can I say something quick to answer Adele? Because I actually have an answer for you. If I was writing a novel about the 12th century, I would not do it any differently than I did with the novel about the Holocaust. There's been this kind of implication tonight that unlike historians who are hemmed in by factuality, novelists write with a kind of wanton disregard for the facts. But I did as much to create that impression as anyone else. But that's just not true. Each fact will allow you to depart from it only by a certain distance, and you must know that distance, and it's different every time. I couldn't say that the Holocaust took place in Peru without making the entire novel about that, because it's so counterfactual. The other thing, and this may be subjective and personal, if we don't know whether the caviar, to stick with the theme of the evening, was red or black, I might pick one and run with it to find out what it means for that person to be eating red instead of black. I mean, for me, by the way, that distinction is enormous. I grew up in Belarus. It was the only thing that was available plentifully and cheaply, and I grew up eating bowlfuls of black caviar. And because in America it's much more expensive, now we eat only red. So the whole story of my life is packed into that question. However, if we know for a fact that the caviar was black, I, as a novelist, would never say it's red. I never falsify fact. I imagine my way into the unknown, but I never falsify fact.
Thank you very much.
For anyone who would like to continue this conversation, please join us in the Great Hall. For anyone who would like to continue the conversation at all, please join us in the Great Hall. Otherwise, have a great evening. Thank you.